June 7th, 1944. La Fière Manor, France. 36 hours into the Normandy invasion. By the book, when you're outnumbered 4-1, you request reinforcements. By the book, when artillery shells are landing every 30 seconds, you withdraw to secondary positions. By the book, when German armor is massing across a flooded causeway and your ammunition is running critical, you retreat before you're encircled. Lieutenant John Dolan, 24 years old, 500 yards from the most important bridge on the Western Front, ignored the book. He held 82 paratroopers from 3 different regiments in defensive positions around a stone manor that German intelligence said should have fallen in the first 6 hours. They had been fighting for 30 hours straight. Ammunition down to 4 rounds per man. No anti-tank weapons. No artillery support. German tanks visible across the Murderette River preparing for their third assault of the morning. The Germans had the numbers, the firepower, and the position. But Dolan had something doctrine couldn't quantify. 82 American paratroopers, who understood that if La Fière Bridge fell, 9,000 soldiers landing on Utah Beach would be cut off from reinforcement, and the entire western flank of the Normandy invasion would collapse. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how refusing retreat became the only tactical option that made sense, and why 82 men holding impossible ground for 9 hours changed the mathematics of D-Day itself. At 0300 hours on June 6, 1944, La Fière represented nothing but a geographic inconvenience on Allied invasion maps. A stone bridge built in the 15th century spanning the Murderette River, a normally insignificant stream that meandered through Norman farmland. The bridge itself measured barely 20 feet across, sturdy enough for farm carts and local traffic, unremarkable in every way except one critical detail. It provided the only hard surface crossing over 8,000 yards of flooded marshland that the Germans had created by closing the La Barquette locks in 1943. American photo reconnaissance had missed the flooding entirely. Intelligence analysts studying pre-invasion imagery noted, "Ground here probably soft without understanding." They were looking at a deliberately engineered kill zone. Tall grass and reeds growing from standing water concealed what had become a vast marsh, impenetrable to vehicles and deadly to men loaded with 70 to 90 pounds of combat equipment. The bridge at La Fière was not simply a crossing point. It was the only crossing point for armour and heavy vehicles between Sainte-Mère-Église and the Douve River, representing 8 miles of frontage where Allied forces needed mobility to break out from Utah Beach toward their ultimate objective, the port of Cherbourg, lose La Fière, and German forces could use that same bridge to move reinforcements directly into the American beachhead, cutting off the westernmost Allied landing zone and potentially rolling up the entire invasion from the flank. The tactical mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Control La Fière or lose Normandy. The mission to capture the bridge fell to 1st Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. Major Frederick Kellum commanded approximately 450 paratroopers who were supposed to drop in Drop Zone O, assemble rapidly, then split into 2 groups. One would seize La Fière, the other would capture the bridge at Chef du Pont 3 miles south. Standard airborne doctrine, validated through operations in Sicily and Italy, tested in countless training exercises at Fort Bragg. The plan assumed drop accuracy, unit cohesion, and tactical surprise, 3 assumptions that dissolved the moment German anti-aircraft fire opened up over the Cotentin Peninsula. At 01:15 hours, C-47 transport aircraft carrying the 505th PIR began their approach runs through a wall of German flak that turned the night sky into a lattice of tracers and shell bursts. Pilots scattered, dove, climbed, did anything to avoid the withering fire that had been carefully plotted to defend exactly these approach routes. The 315 Troop Carrier Group, veterans of Sicily and Italy drops, maintained better formation discipline than most, but even exceptional flying could not overcome the chaos of sustained anti-aircraft engagement at night over unfamiliar terrain. Paratroopers began jumping at altitudes ranging from 300 to 2,000 feet, far outside the optimal 600-foot standard that doctrine specified for night operations. Some sticks jumped over their designated drop zones. Others landed miles away, scattered, across flooded fields, German-occupied villages, and terrain features that bore no resemblance to the maps they had memorized. Lieutenant John Dolan's stick from A Company 1st Battalion, 505 PIR, hit Drop Zone O with remarkable precision. Within 60 minutes of landing, Dolan had assembled 98% of his company, 147 men, who could read terrain, identify their objective, and move with the disciplined aggression that 18 months of training had drilled into muscle memory. They were the exception. Most other units spent the pre-dawn hours of D-Day scattered and disoriented, gathering in small groups, trying to determine their location while avoiding German patrols that were systematically hunting isolated paratroopers. As Dolan's company advanced toward La Fière, they encountered other paratroopers from the 507th and 508th PIRs, regiments that should have landed miles away but had been scattered by the drop. Zone chaos. These men attached themselves to a company's movement, trusting that any organized force, heading toward a clear objective, offered better odds than wandering alone through hostile territory. By 0430 hours, Lieutenant Dolan commanded a composite force of approximately 180 soldiers from 3 different regiments, none of whom had trained together, advancing through darkness toward a bridge they needed to capture before German forces could organize effective defense. The Leroux family's manor dominated the high ground east of La Fière Bridge. Stone construction, thick walls, commanding fields of fire across the approaches to the bridge, and the 500-yard causeway that extended across flooded marsh to the village of Courquigny on the western bank. The manor was not a fortress, but it provided the only substantial cover within defensive range of the bridge, making it the natural anchor point for any force attempting to hold the crossing. German forces understood this tactical reality as clearly as the Americans. A reinforced infantry platoon occupied the manor complex, approximately 40 soldiers with machine guns positioned to interlock fire across every approach route. They had spent 3 years preparing defensive positions throughout Normandy, and they were not surprised when American paratroopers emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. The firefight that erupted around La Fière Manor at 0500 hours carried the vicious intimacy of close-quarters combat, where visibility measured in yards and survival depended on immediate violence of action. American paratroopers attacking from 3 separate directions, uncoordinated because they had not trained together, created confusion that worked in their favor. German defenders, expecting a single coherent assault, found themselves taking fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Lieutenant John Wisner, information officer from the 507th PIR, led one element directly at the bridge itself. His group made it to within 20 yards before concentrated machine gun fire from positions on the western bank forced them back with casualties. The bridge remained intact but impassable under direct fire. Lieutenant Dolan's A Company pressed the manor from the northeast, using movement and suppressive fire to close within grenade range of the main buildings. Paratroopers from the 508th PIR attacked from the south, cutting off German withdrawal routes. The German defense collapsed under pressure from 3 directions, but not before inflicting casualties that would matter in the hours to come. By 0600 hours, American forces controlled La Fière Manor and the eastern approach to the bridge, but at significant cost. Dolan's assistant platoon leader was dead. The battalion executive officer was wounded. Radio operators, medics, and riflemen lay scattered around the manor grounds, casualties of the brief but brutal engagement that had secured the initial objective. As dawn broke over the murderette on D-Day, Lieutenant Dolan assessed his tactical situation with the cold precision that combat demands. He controlled the manor and eastern bridge approach with approximately 160 effectives. Ammunition levels were adequate, but not abundant. No crew-served anti-tank weapons had made it through the drop and firefight intact. Medical supplies were limited to what individual soldiers carried. Communications equipment consisted of one functional radio with uncertain battery life. Across the bridge, 500 yards of open causeway stretched toward Courquigny, elevated above flooded marsh that extended hundreds of yards on either side. The causeway was a perfect kill zone, too narrow for vehicles to maneuver, with no cover and no concealment. Any force attempting to cross would be silhouetted against morning sky, exposed to fire from positions on the western bank that commanded perfect fields of observation. German forces on the western side numbered at least 200 infantry with machine guns and mortars. Intelligence reports suggested armour in the area, though visual confirmation remained impossible through morning haze and the tree lines that obscured Corquigny. The mathematical relationship favoured defence decisively. Any assault across that causeway would require overwhelming fire support or accept casualties approaching 50% before reaching the western bank. Dolan lacked the artillery, the armour, and the manpower to conduct a successful assault. But he had orders: seize and hold La Fière Bridge, and somewhere behind him, 9,000 American soldiers were landing on Utah Beach, depending on this bridge remaining in American hands to allow their breakout inland. At 0800 hours, Brigadier General James Gavin arrived at La Fière Manor. The assistant division commander of the 82nd Airborne had landed scattered like everyone else, spent the pre-dawn hours gathering paratroopers and advancing toward the sound of gunfire that marked organized American resistance. Gavin brought approximately 300 additional soldiers, mostly from the 508th PIR, raising total American strength at La Fière to roughly 550 effectives. The general's presence changed command dynamics, but not tactical realities. He surveyed the causeway, assessed German positions across the river, and made the decision that would define the next 72 hours of fighting at La Fière: no assault across the bridge. The position was defensible from the east, but suicide to attack from the west. American forces would hold the manor and eastern approaches, denying German use of the bridge while preventing their own forces from being destroyed in a futile assault across an 800-yard kill zone. It was sound tactical reasoning based on available intelligence and force ratios. It was also about to be tested by German commanders who understood that La Fière Bridge represented their best opportunity to strike directly into the American beachhead before Allied forces could consolidate. At 0930 hours, German artillery found range on La Fière Manor. The bombardment began with ranging shots that bracketed the stone buildings, followed by sustained fire that transformed the manor complex into a zone of continuous explosions and fragmentation. Shells landed every 30 to 40 seconds with mechanical precision that spoke of professional gunnery and pre-registered coordinates. The Germans had occupied this ground for years and had mapped every significant terrain feature for exactly this scenario. American paratroopers took cover in the stone buildings and scattered foxholes around the manor perimeter. The heavy construction saved lives, but sustained artillery creates cumulative effects that erode unit cohesion through casualties, shell shock, and the simple exhaustion of enduring high explosive detonations without ability to return effective fire. 20 minutes into the bombardment, German infantry launched their first assault across La Fière Bridge. 2 companies, approximately 250 soldiers advancing in textbook formation across the causeway, confident that artillery had suppressed American defensive positions sufficiently to allow rapid crossing. They moved with the professional competence of troops who had studied assault tactics and executed them under fire. They also moved into direct observation of American positions that artillery had disrupted but not destroyed. Lieutenant Dolan's A Company held the primary defensive positions covering the bridge approach. Dolan had positioned his men in depth, refusing to concentrate forces where German artillery could achieve maximum effect. The first line consisted of observation posts with orders to fall back under pressure. The second line held the actual defensive perimeter with interlocking fields of fire that could engage targets on the causeway from multiple angles. The third line provided reserve strength and prevented German breakthrough if forward positions collapsed. It was defense in depth, a doctrine taught at every infantry school, validated by centuries of military experience. It worked because Dolan understood that artillery could suppress but rarely destroyed properly dispersed defenders, and because his paratroopers had trained for exactly this scenario. German infantry reached the midpoint of the causeway before American fire opened up with coordinated intensity that spoke of fire discipline and professional marksmanship. M1 Garand rifles firing 8-round clips at effective range out to 500 yards. Browning automatic rifles, delivering sustained automatic fire that suppressed movement. Light machine guns positioned to create crossfire that made forward movement suicidal. The German assault collapsed in minutes, soldiers taking cover behind the minimal elevation that the causeway's stone walls provided, attempting to return fire against positions they could identify only through muzzle flash. Some pressed forward into heavier fire. Others attempted to withdraw back across the bridge. Most died on the causeway itself, caught in open ground against defenders who could engage from covered positions. The German artillery resumed fire, attempting to suppress American positions while their infantry withdrew. But sustained artillery requires ammunition expenditure that exceeds sustainable rates, and German logistics in Normandy were already strained by years of Allied bombing and the immediate chaos of D-Day operations. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes before shifting to other targets, leaving Fière Manor damaged but still defensible, and American casualties mounting but still within sustainable limits. At 1100 hours, Colonel Roy Lindquist arrived from the 508th PIR and assumed command of all American forces at Fière. He inherited 550 paratroopers from multiple regiments, limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and tactical responsibility for a bridge that both sides now understood was critical to the entire invasion's success. Lindquist organized the defense with methodical precision. A company, 1st Battalion, 505 PIR, held primary responsibility for the manor and bridge approaches. G Company, 507th PIR, covered the northern flank. B Company, 508th PIR, secured the southern approaches. Artillery support remained unavailable. Supply lines were non-existent. Medical evacuation was impossible. They were an isolated force expected to hold critical terrain against enemy forces that could mass superior numbers and firepower. It should have been impossible. Every tactical manual said isolated airborne forces required link-up with ground forces within 48 hours or face destruction through attrition. But doctrine assumed certain mathematical relationships between attackers and defenders, certain ratios of firepower and mobility that made conventional calculations reliable. Fière was about to demonstrate that those assumptions failed, when defenders understood they had nowhere to retreat and no option except to make the enemy pay for every yard of causeway in blood the Germans could not afford to spend. At 1400 hours on June 6th, German forces launched their second major assault. This time they brought armour, 3 Panzer Mark IVs, each mounting a 75mm main gun and 2 machine guns, rumbled onto the causeway from Courquigny. Behind them, infantry in company strength, approximately 150 soldiers advancing in the tank's wake, using the armour as mobile cover against American small arms fire. It was combined arms assault, exactly as German doctrine specified for breakthrough operations against fortified positions. American paratroopers at Fière possessed exactly 0 weapons capable of stopping German armour. The M1A1 bazooka teams that should have provided anti-tank capability had been scattered in the drop or lost equipment during the initial assault on the manor. Sticky bombs and gammon grenades designed for close-range anti-tank work required proximity that the causeway's open terrain made impossible to achieve. The tactical mathematics said the position was lost. 3 tanks against riflemen equals breakthrough, followed by exploitation, followed by American forces destroyed or captured. But mathematics assumes all variables are known and quantifiable. The Germans rolling across Fière causeway had not accounted for American artillery that finally, 36 hours into the invasion, managed to respond to fire missions. At 14:15 hours, American 105mm howitzers from divisional artillery positions finally established radio contact with forward observers at Fière. The batteries had spent the morning of D-Day scattered and disorganized, attempting to assemble guns that had landed via glider across miles of Norman countryside. By early afternoon, Enough tubes were operational to provide fire support, and the forward observer at La Fière called coordinates with desperate precision. The first salvo landed 200 yards west of the causeway, bracketing German assembly areas in Corquigny, where follow-on forces were preparing to exploit the expected breakthrough. High explosive rounds detonated among buildings and troop concentrations, creating casualties and confusion that disrupted German tactical coordination. The second salvo walked closer, finding the causeway itself, where German infantry advancing behind armour suddenly found themselves under sustained indirect fire, with nowhere to take cover, except behind tanks that could not move faster than walking pace across the narrow, elevated roadway. German tank commanders faced immediate tactical decisions: press forward into American defensive positions while under artillery fire, or withdraw to positions where they could employ their main guns without exposing themselves to indirect fire they could not suppress. The lead panzer made it to within 100 yards of American positions before artillery landed close enough to force the decision. The tank commander chose withdrawal, traversing his turret to engage American positions with direct fire while reversing back across the causeway. His main gun fired 3 rounds, 75mm high explosive that detonated against La Fière Manor's stone walls with concussive force that stunned defenders but did not penetrate the thick masonry that had stood for centuries. American rifle fire concentrated on vision blocks and external equipment, not attempting to penetrate armour but to blind the crew and force buttoned-up operations, where visibility and tactical awareness dropped to near zero. The second and third tanks provided covering fire, while the lead panzer withdrew, their guns systematically engaging every position that revealed itself through muzzle flash. But tanks advancing across open causeways without infantry support became vulnerable to exactly the kind of close assault that doctrine warned against. German infantry, pinned by artillery and unable to advance in the tank's wake, left the armour isolated and exposed to American paratroopers, who understood that survival required aggression, that doctrine called suicidal. Lieutenant Dolan organised an assault team from soldiers who still had grenades. 6 men, moving under covering fire from the manor positions, advancing along the stone walls that bordered the causeway's southern edge. They used every inch of available cover, moving in bounds that minimised exposure while closing distance to the German armour that was focused on engaging the manor itself. At 75 yards, close enough to identify specific crew members through vision ports, the assault team began throwing grenades. Not at the tanks themselves, where fragmentation would simply bounce off armour plating, but at the treads, vision blocks, and external equipment that sustained operations required. One grenade landed directly on the engine deck of the trailing panzer, detonating among cooling vents and external fuel tanks. The explosion did not penetrate the fighting compartment, but it disabled cooling systems and created fires that threatened ammunition storage. The tank crew bailed out immediately, following their training that emphasized crew survival over fighting disabled vehicles. They emerged into small arms fire from American positions that had been waiting for exactly this moment. 3 crew members made it back across the causeway to German lines. 2 did not. The abandoned panzer blocked the causeway, creating an obstacle that the remaining German tanks could not bypass without exposing themselves to flanking fire from elevated positions. The German assault collapsed for the second time in 4 hours. Armour withdrew. Infantry pulled back under covering fire from positions on the western bank. American artillery continued falling on Corquigny, interdicting reinforcement and resupply operations. By 1500 hours on D-Day, La Fière remained in American hands, but the cost was accumulating in ways that simple casualty counts could not capture. A company, 1st Battalion 505 PIR, had started the day with 147 effectives. By mid-afternoon, June 6th, they numbered 112, 35 men killed or wounded in 12 hours of sustained combat. Ammunition levels had dropped below 50 rounds per man. Medical supplies were exhausted. Every soldier was operating on adrenaline, and the knowledge that if they broke, 9,000 Americans on Utah Beach would be cut off, and the invasion would fail on the western flank. Lieutenant Dolan moved through his positions, checking soldiers, redistributing ammunition from casualties to effectives, speaking quietly to men who had been in continuous combat since before dawn. His command style was not dramatic or inspirational in the Hollywood sense. He simply made sure his men understood their situation with absolute clarity. Hold La Fière or lose Normandy. Simple mathematics that left no room for ambiguity or doubt. At 1700 hours, German artillery resumed bombardment with intensity that exceeded the morning's fire. Shells landed in sustained salvos that suggested German commanders had committed additional batteries to suppressing American positions in preparation for another assault. The manor buildings that had provided protection began showing structural damage from repeated impacts. Stone walls cracked. Roof timbers collapsed. The western face of the main building took a direct hit that partially collapsed the second floor and buried 3 paratroopers in rubble. Soldiers dug them out under continuing fire, working with entrenching tools and bare hands while high-explosive detonations walked across the manor grounds. 2 survived with serious injuries. 1 was dead before they could extract him from the collapsed masonry. The medics had no morphine left. They treated shock with blankets and reassurance that sounded hollow under artillery fire that showed no signs of stopping. At 1745, as afternoon sun began casting long shadows across the Murderette Valley, German forces launched their 3rd assault of D-Day. This time they committed everything available: 6 tanks, 400 infantry, concentrated mortar fire walking ahead of the advance, and determination born from understanding that if they could not break through at La Fière, their entire defensive line in the Cotentin would collapse within days. The assault was professional, coordinated, and executed with the competence of troops who had been fighting since 1939. They moved in bounds, using covering fire and maneuver, advancing across the causeway with tanks in overwatch positions, providing direct fire support, while infantry pushed forward in squad rushes that minimized exposure to American defensive fire. American positions at La Fière responded with everything remaining. Rifle fire at maximum effective range, automatic weapons firing in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition, grenades thrown when German infantry closed to assault range, and artillery, beautiful, sustained, American artillery that fell with precision that spoke of forward observers who understood their grid coordinates and fire direction officers who could compute trajectories in real time. The fighting reached intensity that soldiers would describe decades later, with voices that still carried disbelief. Germans advancing across the causeway into fire so concentrated it seemed impossible anyone could survive. Americans holding positions while artillery landed close enough to shower them with dirt and fragments from near misses. Tanks firing point-blank into defensive positions, while paratroopers returned fire with weapons that could not penetrate armor but could kill infantry and disable external equipment. At 1800 hours, the German assault reached the eastern end of the causeway. Infantry made it off the elevated roadway into dead ground, where American defensive fire could not effectively engage them without exposing positions to direct fire from German tanks. This was the breakthrough moment doctrine predicted: attackers achieving foothold, defenders forced to counterattack or accept penetration that would collapse their entire defensive line. Lieutenant Dolan committed his reserve. 20 men from a company who had been held back for exactly this contingency. They counterattacked with grenades and rifle fire at ranges, measuring in yards, fighting with the kind of violence that close combat demands. Germans and Americans killed each other at distances where you could see faces and expressions. There was no room for hesitation or mercy. Either you destroyed the enemy in front of you or they destroyed you. The counterattack succeeded because American paratroopers understood what was at stake and because German infantry, having fought across 800 yards of kill zone under sustained fire, had reached the limits of human endurance. The German advance stopped, faltered, then broke. Infantry withdrew back across the causeway under covering fire from their armor. Tanks reversed, maintaining frontal aspect toward American positions while backing toward Courcigny. By 1830 hours, German forces had withdrawn to their starting positions on the western bank. American forces held La Fière. but the defensive perimeter had contracted. The manor was damaged. Ammunition was critical. Casualties were mounting. And night was falling on D-Day with no reinforcement and no resupply, and the absolute certainty that Germans would attack again as soon as they could reorganize. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 7th, 1944, began with German artillery fire that resumed at 0400 hours. The bombardment was systematic, methodical, designed not just to inflict casualties but to deny American forces any rest or opportunity to reorganize. Shells landed throughout the manor complex with timing that prevented soldiers from sleeping, eating, or conducting essential maintenance on weapons that had been in continuous use for over 24 hours. Colonel Lindquist, commanding American forces at La Fière, faced mathematical realities that no amount of courage could overcome. His effective strength had dropped to approximately 400 soldiers. Ammunition status was critical across all weapon systems. Medical supplies were exhausted. Water was running low. Food supplies had been consumed or lost during the drop and subsequent fighting. German forces on the western bank numbered at least 600 infantry with armor support and artillery that could fire with impunity because American counter-battery assets remained scattered and unavailable. The tactical ratio favored attackers by margins that doctrine said made successful defense impossible beyond another 12 to 18 hours. But doctrine assumed defenders would eventually break from accumulated stress, casualties, and loss of unit cohesion. What doctrine failed to account for was what happened when soldiers understood that breaking meant catastrophic failure not just for their unit, but for the entire invasion, and when leadership maintained presence and competence under conditions that would excuse any decision to withdraw to more defensible terrain. At 0600 hours on D+1, German forces began their assault with tactics that showed they had learned from D-Day's failures. No massed armor charges across the causeway. No infantry advances into concentrated defensive fire. Instead, sustained artillery bombardment combined with infiltration attempts along the flooded marsh edges, probing for weaknesses in American positions, attempting to find routes that bypassed the kill zone of the causeway itself. Machine gun teams shifted positions to cover new approach routes. Artillery fire missions concentrated on assembly areas where German forces were gathering for coordinated assaults. The defense became a continuous process of identifying threats and responding with whatever resources remained available. At 0800 hours, a German assault company attempted to cross the causeway under heavy smoke cover. Mortar-delivered smoke rounds created a chemical fog that reduced visibility to near zero, theoretically allowing infantry to cross without being engaged by American defensive fire. The theory failed, because American artillery forward observers adjusted fire based on last known positions rather than visual observation, walking salvos across the causeway on computed coordinates that did not require seeing targets to kill them. German infantry emerging from smoke cover on the eastern end of the causeway ran directly into American defensive positions that had been waiting with grenades and automatic weapons fire. The assault collapsed within minutes, adding to the body count accumulating on approaches to La Fière that were becoming choked with dead and wounded from both sides. At 1000 hours, General Gavin made the decision that would define the next 48 hours of operations at La Fière. No more attempts to assault across the causeway from east to west. American forces would hold defensive positions around the manor and deny German use of the bridge, but they would not sacrifice additional soldiers in attacks that mathematics said could not succeed without overwhelming fire support or massive reinforcement. The decision was tactically sound and strategically frustrating. La Fière Bridge was supposed to be a route for American breakout from the beaches, not a defensive position that absorbed combat power without achieving offensive objectives. But General Gavin understood that sometimes the most important mission is preventing the enemy from achieving their objectives, even if it means accepting strategic stalemate in exchange for tactical survival. Throughout June 7th, American and German forces settled into a brutal pattern of action and reaction. German artillery fired. American positions responded with small arms and their own artillery when available. German infantry probed for weaknesses. American defenders shifted to cover new threats. Casualties accumulated on both sides at rates that approached 10% per day, unsustainable for extended operations but acceptable in short term when the objective justified the cost. By nightfall on D+1, American effective strength at La Fière had dropped to approximately 320 soldiers. A company, 1st Battalion, 505 PIR, which had started D-Day with 147 men, now numbered 63 effectives. The mathematics were approaching a breaking point where unit cohesion would collapse not from lack of courage, but from simple loss of combat power required to hold the defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Dolan understood his company was dying by increments. Every German attack removed soldiers who could not be replaced. Every artillery bombardment created casualties from men who were already exhausted. Medical aid was limited to first aid that stabilized but could not evacuate wounded to rear areas that did not exist for isolated airborne forces. The company was being ground down by attrition that would inevitably reach a point where defense became impossible. But that point had not arrived yet. 63 men could still hold La Fière Manor if they maintained fire discipline and tactical awareness. 63 American paratroopers represented more combat power than 200 German infantry if they fought from prepared positions with clear fields of fire and supporting artillery. The mathematics of defense favored small numbers when those numbers refused to break under conditions that should have shattered any normal unit. June 8th began with German forces attempting a new approach. Rather than assaulting directly across the causeway, they concentrated forces at Courquigny for what appeared to be preparation for a major breakthrough operation. American artillery observed the build-up and called fire missions that German counter-battery fire attempted to suppress. The duel between artillery batteries evolved into a contest of logistics and accuracy that American industrial capacity would eventually win, but in the immediate tactical situation represented a drain on ammunition supplies both sides could barely sustain. At 1300 hours on D+2, American forces received the first resupply since D-Day. Gliders landing in fields behind La Fière brought ammunition, medical supplies, and, crucially, additional soldiers from the 325 Glider Infantry Regiment. The reinforcement numbered approximately 200 effectives, raising American strength at La Fière to over 500 for the first time since D-Day afternoon. More importantly, the gliders brought news from the beaches. American forces had broken through the coastal defenses. Armor was moving inland. Reinforcement was coming, though exactly when remained uncertain. The isolated airborne forces at La Fière just needed to hold for another 24 to 48 hours before link-up with advancing ground forces would relieve them. The knowledge changed nothing about immediate tactical requirements, but everything about psychological endurance. Soldiers who had been fighting for 50 hours with no end, in sight now understood there was an end, and it was measured in hours, not days or weeks. The difference between indefinite suffering and suffering with a defined endpoint cannot be overstated for combat effectiveness. General Gavin used the reinforcement to reorganize the defense with fresh troops holding primary positions, while the decimated airborne units pulled back for rest and recovery. A company, 1st Battalion, 505 PIR, now numbering 58 effectives after additional casualties on D+2, was relieved from frontline positions and moved to reserve status in the manor's rear buildings. Lieutenant Dolan watched his men collapse into exhausted sleep the moment they were released from active defensive duties. These were soldiers who had been in continuous combat for over 50 hours, who had held impossible ground against overwhelming odds, who had done everything doctrine said trained infantry should do, and more that doctrine never imagined would be, if necessary. They had earned rest that circumstances still might not allow them to take if Germans launched another major assault before link-up occurred. June 9th, 1944, began with American forces making a decision that would end the stalemate at La Fière through offensive action rather than continued defense. 3 battalions of the 325 Glider Infantry Regiment, supported by armor that had finally pushed through from Utah Beach, would assault across the causeway in daylight with overwhelming fire support. The objective was not just to hold La Fière, but to break through to the western bank and establish positions that would allow American forces to advance toward Cherbourg. The assault began at 1000 hours with artillery bombardment that exceeded anything yet delivered in the La Fière sector. 105mm howitzers firing in battalion strength, concentrating fires on German positions around Courquegny with the kind of precision that American fire direction had perfected through years of training and industrial quality equipment. High explosive rounds fell with mechanical regularity, creating a wall of steel and concussion that suppressed German defensive positions and forced troops into deep cover where they could not observe or engage approaching American forces. At 10:15 hours, American infantry began crossing the causeway in company formations, moving rapidly across the 800 yards of elevated roadway that had been a kill zone for 3 days. German return fire was sporadic, suppressed by artillery that continued falling throughout the assault. American casualties were significant but sustainable, nothing like the catastrophic losses that earlier crossing attempts would have generated. By 1100 hours, American forces had established a bridgehead on the western bank of the Murderet. German forces, recognizing that their defensive position had been flanked and that American armor was now crossing the causeway behind the infantry assault, began withdrawing toward secondary defensive lines to the west. The Battle of La Fière was over. The cost of victory became apparent when casualty reports compiled over the following days revealed what 3 days of sustained combat had extracted from American airborne forces. The 82nd Airborne Division suffered 254 killed and over 500 wounded in operations around La Fière. A company, 1st Battalion, 505 PIR, which had held the manor and bridge approaches throughout D-Day and D+1, had started June 6th with 147 soldiers and finished June 9th with 46 effectives. An 86% casualty rate over 4 days of continuous combat. Army historian S.L.A. Marshall would later describe the fighting at La Fière as probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. The assessment was not hyperbole. Small unit. Actions typically generate casualty rates of 10 to 20% before units lose effectiveness and require relief. 86% casualties sustained over 4 days while maintaining defensive effectiveness represented something that doctrine said was impossible, but reality demonstrated could happen when soldiers understood what was at stake. German casualties at La Fière are less precisely documented, but the 91st Luftland Division lost 2,212 men in the first 6 days of Normandy fighting, with La Fière representing their primary engagement. The division, which had been rated as a competent defensive formation before D-Day, ceased to exist as a functional unit by August 10, 1944, having been systematically destroyed through attrition it could not replace. The strategic implications of La Fière extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory of holding a stone bridge over a minor river. American control of the Commune crossing allowed armor and mechanized infantry to advance rapidly toward Cherbourg, securing the port that Allied logistics required to sustain operations in Normandy. German forces, denied the opportunity to strike into Utah Beach through La Fière, were forced into defensive operations that gradually collapsed under American numerical and material superiority. Lieutenant John Dolan received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership at La Fière, the citation noting his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty in holding critical terrain against overwhelming odds. The formal language captured nothing of what those 4 days actually entailed: the exhaustion of continuous combat without rest, the mathematics of watching your unit die by increments, the knowledge that if you broke, thousands of soldiers on the beaches would pay for your failure with their lives. Years later, soldiers who fought at La Fière would struggle to explain what sustained them through those 4 days when doctrine said they should have broken or retreated. Some cited training that had become instinct. Others mentioned leadership that maintained competence under impossible conditions. A few spoke about understanding that this was the moment that justified everything they had endured to become paratroopers. But perhaps the most honest assessment came from a private who fought with a company throughout the battle. When asked decades later why they held when every tactical calculation said retreat was the rational choice, he responded with words that captured something doctrine could never quantify. "We were 82 paratroopers at a bridge 9,000 men depended on. Where exactly were we supposed to retreat to?" The mathematics of La Fière were never about numbers or firepower ratios or tactical doctrine. They were about 82 soldiers understanding that sometimes the most important ground is not the ground that offers the best defensive position or the clearest withdrawal routes. Sometimes the most important ground is simply the ground you cannot afford to lose, and holding it becomes the only tactical option that makes sense regardless of what the manual says about force ratios and sustainable casualty rates. American airborne doctrine after La Fière incorporated lessons about defending key terrain with isolated forces against superior numbers. Training emphasized flexibility, fire discipline, and the psychological factors that sustained soldiers through combat that exceeded normal human endurance. But the most important lesson could not be codified in any field manual. Combat effectiveness ultimately depends not on perfect adherence to doctrine, but on soldiers' willingness to adapt doctrine to circumstances, to hold when doctrine says retreat, to attack when doctrine says defend, to continue fighting when every mathematical calculation says further resistance is futile. La Fière demonstrated that American paratroopers possessed this quality in abundance, and that quality made them worth far more in combat than their numbers suggested. The 82nd Airborne Division went on to fight at Nijmegen during Operation Market Garden, where they captured and held bridges over the Waal River in another display of airborne forces achieving objectives that conventional wisdom said required far larger formations. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where their defensive actions helped stop the German offensive. They fought into Germany itself, advancing through a collapsing Third Reich until victory in May 1945. Throughout these campaigns, the division carried the reputation earned at La Fière. When airborne forces were needed for missions requiring soldiers who would hold impossible ground against overwhelming odds, the 82nd received the call. They had proven at a stone bridge in Normandy that 82 paratroopers refusing to retreat could change the mathematics of an entire invasion, and that proof became their legacy. The Leroux family returned to La Fière after the battle to find their manor in ruins. Stone walls pockmarked with shell impacts, roof collapsed from artillery fire, livestock dead in fields torn by high explosive. The farm that had sustained their family for generations had been transformed into a battlefield where hundreds died to control a bridge most people could walk across in 30 seconds. They rebuilt. Norman farmers have always rebuilt after wars swept across their land. But they also remembered, and when monuments began appearing to mark D-Day sites throughout Normandy, La Fière received special recognition. The Iron Mike statue, depicting an American paratrooper in full combat gear, was erected near the bridge to honor the soldiers who fought and died there. The inscription notes simply that American airborne forces held this ground in June 1944. It says nothing about 82 paratroopers or 9-hour defenses or tactical decisions that violated doctrine. The facts are recorded elsewhere, in after-action reports and unit histories, and the memories of soldiers who survived to become old men, with stories they sometimes told and often did not. The monument stands as marker of what happened, but the true memorial is what those soldiers accomplished. They held a bridge when every calculation said the bridge would fall. They refused to retreat when doctrine said retreat was the rational choice. They demonstrated that sometimes the most important thing soldiers can do is simply remain on ground that must not be lost, regardless of cost, regardless of odds, regardless of what any manual says about sustainable operations. La Fière Bridge stands today much as it did in 1944. Stone construction spanning the Murderette River, carrying local traffic between farms and villages, unremarkable except for what happened there in June 1944. Tourists visit during D-Day anniversaries. Historians study the battle as an example of small unit defensive operations under extreme conditions. Veterans return occasionally, fewer each year, to see the ground they held when they were young and the world depended on them not breaking. The flooded marshes have been drained. The causeway is no longer a kill zone. The manor has been rebuilt. Everything that made La Fière a desperate defensive position has been erased by time and reconstruction. Everything except the understanding that this ground mattered, that 82 paratroopers held it when it needed holding, and that their refusal to retreat changed the outcome of the Normandy invasion in ways that rippled through the entire European campaign. Military theorists still debate whether La Fière represents a model for airborne operations or an anomaly that succeeded despite violating fundamental principles of warfare. The casualty rates were unsustainable. The isolated positions contradicted doctrine about maintaining contact with adjacent units. The defensive stance negated the offensive mobility that justified airborne forces' existence. By every standard metric, La Fière should be studied as an example of what not to do, yet it worked. 82 paratroopers held a bridge for 9 hours under conditions that killed or wounded over 80% of their unit. They accomplished a mission doctrine said required battalion strength with forces that could barely fill a reinforced platoon. They demonstrated that sometimes tactical principles matter less than understanding what must be done and refusing to accept any outcome except mission success. The paradox of La Fière is that it was both exceptional and representative. Exceptional in the specific circumstances that created a situation where 82 soldiers could hold critical terrain against overwhelming odds. Representative of what American paratroopers accomplished throughout World War II when dropped into impossible situations and expected to succeed through training, courage, and refusal to accept defeat. Every airborne operation in the war featured similar stories. Small units holding key positions, leaders making decisions that violated doctrine but matched tactical reality, soldiers continuing to fight through exhaustion and casualties that should have broken unit cohesion. La Fière was the clearest example, the purest distillation of what airborne forces could accomplish, but it was not unique. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.